It's Tuesday, it's 12:15 and we're live in Westminster. Keir Starmer is accused of echoing far-right language in his immigration speech.
I don't think it's right to make those comparisons. It's completely different. And the Prime Minister said yesterday, I think almost in the same breath, talked about the diverse country that we are and that being part of our strength.
A man is arrested over suspected arson attacks on two properties linked to the Prime Minister. Severe hunger in Gaza amid a tightening blockade. Is Israel losing international support?
For many years, I've been in this House 20 years, I have supported Israel, pretty much at all costs, quite frankly. But today, I want to say that I got it wrong.
In Britain and across Europe, free speech, I fear, is in retreat.
Is the Vice President right? We ask one of JD Vance's close friends. With me today, Labour MP Rachel Blake, Conservative MP and Shadow Business Minister Harriet Baldwin, Liberal Democrat MP Max Wilkinson and the academic and Conservative commentator James Orr. This is Politics Live. Hello and welcome. You heard the Home Secretary there in the headlines. Here is the BBC News coverage of what she was saying. Yvette Cooper backs Prime Minister over Island of Strangers remark. We covered the speech yesterday, but he has been asked to defend comments he made when setting out his plans to curb net migration. He said the UK risked becoming an island of strangers without tough new policies. In a diverse nation like ours, we risk becoming an island of strangers, not a nation that walks forward together. My opening question, starting with you, Rachel Blake. Was he right? We risk becoming an island of strangers without curbing migration?
I think he was right in talking about the global talent that's coming to this country. I know so many people in my constituency who've come here to work and contribute to our economic growth. And he talks about how important it is that we work together, as you said in your opening remarks, that we work together towards that economic growth that we so desperately need.
But that's not my question. Was he right to say that unless net migration is curbed and cut significantly, he said, we risk becoming an island of strangers?
He's talking about how we need to all work together, and the measures in this immigration bill are really important for our economic growth, for our public services and for skills in this country. I think that's really important. And what he's saying is we mustn't risk not working together, and I think that he's
so you were
right
comfortable
to be
with that
talking
language?
about that. I think he's right to be talking about that.
Right. Harriet, what did you make of the language and the rhetoric? It was striking yesterday from the Prime Minister, who's clearly been on something of a journey, because we haven't heard him use that kind of language before. He's always talked of the benefits of immigration. What do you make, or do you agree with him that we risk becoming an island of strangers?
Well, Jo, I think, he's responsible for his own words, but I think what I would say is that I do believe net migration has been too high. And I think that you highlight the fact that his rhetoric differs from some of the actions he's taken, not just in the past, where he's been very much in favour of more migration. He's supported letters that do not deport foreign criminals, for example. And last night he whipped his MPs to vote down our amendments to the Borders Bill, which would have restricted the numbers coming here and also disapplied the European human rights legislation to deportation cases. So in terms of his actions, I don't think they tie in with his rhetoric, and I think that the public do want to see net migration brought down.
Right, but of course it soared under previous Conservative governments, despite equally strident language promising to cut migration every which way. The opposite happened.
We're the first to acknowledge that we got that wrong, and that we announced in the early 2024 some measures that we'll see the impact of. But we still think there's more to do, and we encourage the government to take the suggestions that we made in the amendments to the legislation yesterday.
Was the Prime Minister right to use that kind of language, referring to an island of strangers that we risk becoming unless levels of net migration are cut significantly?
No, he was wrong. I don't think that kind of language is useful in this kind of debate. We all know that we need to undo the work that the Conservatives did, which basically left our asylum and immigration system, in a sense, where people didn't really trust it anymore. But to retain trust, to regain trust, it's important at the outset to use language that brings people together rather than is divisive. Now, I don't like that use of language that the Prime Minister used yesterday. I raised it in the House, but it was notable actually that on the Labour benches there were Labour MPs who were also raising the same issues. Now, the point that I made was that we'll remember what happened after the Theresa May speech about the citizen of nowhere, and that was seriously harmful to the public debate. And what the Prime Minister is saying, I understand the points that he's making about immigration and trying to get a system back under control that people can trust.
Right.
But
so you do support cutting net migration?
Well, the net migration figures are obviously too high, and they are coming down already. That's obvious. But what we need to do is maintain a level of public debate that does not set people against each other and that is not divisive. And the use of language the Prime Minister deployed yesterday didn't help.
Right. Well, Max was referring to members of the Labour benches, some of them. Here's one, James, Nadia Whittam. The step up in anti-migrant rhetoric, she tweets, from the government is shameful and dangerous. Migrants are our neighbours, friends and family. To suggest that Britain risks becoming an island of strangers because of immigration mimics the scaremongering of the far right. Is that language that he is using, correct in terms of the sort of warning that he's giving or not?
I think worrying about language and policing people's language is a massive exercise in distraction from the underlying issues. We know how much the British people care about this issue. Every opportunity they've been given the chance to express a view, whether it's the 2010 election, 2015 election, Brexit 2016, to 2019 election, and so on and so on, they've been absolutely unequivocal on left and right that migration is far too high. If it were really the case that migration was powering economic productivity, why is it the case that over the last 15 years, where we've seen unprecedented spikes in immigration, productivity has tanked, GDP has slowed, and our debt-to-GDP ratio is going through the roof?
Right. I mean, it's interesting that there are some people who think we don't know the counterfactual to that argument in terms of the economy. The Prime Minister is keen to say economically, where again he has talked about the benefits of immigration, that there was no growth or very little growth over those 4 years. But would it have been worse without those levels of net migration? Would we have been in recession?
Presumably his view is that they're not good for productivity and economic growth if he wants to slow down the numbers.
Right, but there's been a complete change, this cultural and economic shift in what the Prime Minister thinks about immigration. What's prompted that?
So I think if you listen to the speech all the way through, you'd listen to him talking about... Good. I listened to him talking about global talent, the diversity of our country, and also wanting to really invest in skills so that people are able to work and enjoy the economic benefits of that skills development. And I think as a whole, that's what the government's trying to get to.
Just on this diversity point, I mean, I agreed with the first half of what Yvette Cooper said, and I'm much less clear about whether I agree with the second half of the statement. I don't think diversity is a strength in and of itself. I think diversity is a challenge. It's not a challenge we can't overcome, but it's a challenge that in order to overcome, we need to be able to displace it with a sense of solidarity and common purpose, a spirit of patriotism, a sense of being in it together. And I think we are an increasingly siloed nation. I think a lot of the evidence suggests that increased levels of diversity lowers social trust between groups and within groups.
Right. Do you agree with that? We are a nation that is living in silos.
No, that's not a description of the community that I live in.
It's not in Cheltenham, it's not, definitely. Well, or Cambridge.
Well, I let you speak when you were speaking, James. If you want to interrupt, we can have a chat. I mean, Cheltenham is a town of many different faces. We have areas of entrenched poverty. And in those areas, I do not see a lack of community. In fact, I used to represent one as a councillor. It's one of the strongest communities I know. It is diverse. And those areas do have issues which are not caused by migration. They're caused by government failure to actually provide services. And the systematic defunding of local government and many other services, the NHS, other issues as well, that has led to communities feeling like they're not being listened to. The solution to this, is clearly not going to be to use divisive language and to talk and to try to whip things up. That's not going to get us anywhere.
Can we also make the distinction between legal migration and illegal migration? And I think because it's legal migration, it's the numbers of legal migration that have been so high. They have been high, but also illegal migration.
Right, but just before we move on, would you both accept that by using strong language and the sort of rhetoric we've heard, it bears no relation to the actions and outcomes of the policies that you talk about? I mean, we heard from numerous Conservative politicians the sort of rhetoric that Keir Starmer is using, but net migration continued to go up. And so far, it hasn't come down under Labour either.
Well, look, we're putting the framework in place. That was the bill that Dame Harriet was talking about. But just to this point about, let's look at the really big picture here. Let's look at the communities in my constituency where people are living completely in a diverse, strong city. And our diversity is quite clearly our strength here in terms of the contributions that people from all different backgrounds make. And that's really what this country is about. And we saw that last week in our VE Day celebrations. And you saw people from all different backgrounds coming together to talk about their strong Britain.
All right. It might be worth saying, when you're doing a U-turn, you've got to pull the handbrake really hard. And it looks like Starmer's heated rhetoric here is, in effect, an attempt to pull the handbrake as hard as possible, because he's on record over the last few years as being effectively pro-relaxed approaches to border control.
I'm sure we'll come back to this subject in the coming days and weeks. Let's talk about President Trump. He's arrived in the Middle East. The US president is hoping to secure investment. You can see him here arriving in Riyadh from Air Force One. He's got a 4-day trip to Saudi Arabia, Qatar and the UAE. He is focused on investment deals, but we understand that the war in Gaza is also on the agenda. Here in the UK, there has been support amongst parliamentarians that the UK should officially recognise a Palestinian state. This morning it was being reported that 69 Labour MPs and 6 Labour peers have penned a joint letter to the Prime Minister Keir Starmer urging him to officially recognise a Palestinian state. And last week The Guardian reported that more than a dozen senior Conservative MPs and peers broke ranks with their party and also wrote to the Prime Minister on the issue. Let's have a look at this from Labour MP Andrew Pakes. He tweeted, growing support for the recognition of a Palestinian state amongst parliamentarians alongside Labour colleagues. I've written to the government urging them to support recognition at the UN conference in June as a first step towards a durable peace and negotiations. And this is the Guardian headline on Conservative support. Senior Tory MPs and peers break ranks to call for recognition of Palestine. Is that what the government should do? Officially recognise a Palestinian state, Rachel?
The government has that already as part of its diplomatic efforts, but as part of a process towards a two-state solution. And I think we all desperately want to see the peace in Gaza, and the route towards that is through diplomacy and through negotiation, and that's absolutely. And
not declaring in the House of Commons that the UK recognises a Palestinian state.
The government has been really clear about this being part of diplomatic efforts, and that's what the Foreign Secretary is working towards.
One of President Trump's achievements in his first term of office was the Abraham Accords, which is the recognition of the state of Israel by many of the countries in the Middle East that have not previously had diplomatic relations with Israel. Now, we've had this appalling, ghastly, unutterably terrible conflict. And we have a situation where there are still nearly 60 Israeli hostages being held. And a precondition for a sustainable peace must be the release of those hostages, must be the removal of Hamas as the ruling force in Gaza. And I think that we've always had a bipartisan point of view that the recognition of two-state solution is important. We're on a path towards it, but it has to be when the conditions are right, and they clearly are not.
But in the absence of any pathway towards a two-state solution, particularly at the moment, I mean, there isn't a pathway. There's war going on in Gaza. Do you support your colleagues in Parliament calling for the recognition of a Palestinian state? Would it help create some sort of pathway to peace?
I would say that immediate move down that would be unilateral, would not acknowledge the fact that there are hostages still being held, Israeli hostages still being held, and that Hamas is still in control of the Gaza Strip. So I know these are not the preconditions under which you could do that.
Would you support the UK supporting and recognising a Palestinian state at this point?
Yes, the Liberal Democrats have been very clear for a very long time that we support a Palestinian state.
Well, how would you
two-state
convince Harriet Baldwin and Rachel, in fact, that that is the right way to go?
Well, I think this is exactly the way things are going already, it's obvious that to actually get to peace, we need to recognise that the Palestinians have a right to statehood. What's happening at the moment with the blockade is totally unconscionable. The actions of Netanyahu are causing outrage across the world. They've caused outrage among our colleagues in Parliament. It is clear that this is the direction that politics is taking. And actually, if we're going to get a solution which recognises the rights of Palestinians, clearly we need to recognise their statehood.
But you do
as
understand that Hamas do not recognise Israel's right to exist.
And we need to recognise on all sides here that there are issues that need to be resolved. But ultimately, the right of Palestinians to have their own state is something that is shared across party lines. Liberal Democrats have been there for quite some time.
I mean, is it laudable?
Israel already exists as a state.
That some parliamentarians on both the Conservative and a growing number on the Labour side, and you've heard obviously what the Liberal Democrats think, support this idea? No, it would help the discussion.
I think it's the opposite of laudable. If you recognise a Palestinian state, you are recognising a state that will be governed by Hamas. And that is inconceivable at the present juncture, anyway, for Israel. We've been talking about a two-state solution for 25 years. Israel tried to, when it withdrew from Gaza in 2005, tried to start on the path towards recognition of Palestine as a state. We saw how that ended. The Palestinians elected Hamas, and Hamas have been in power ever since. And as Harriet said, the Palestinians, Hamas is dedicated not to a two-state solution, but to a no-state solution. It's in its charter. The DNA of Hamas is to wipe Israel off the face of the earth. The central truth in the Middle East remains what it has been for the last 25 years, namely that if Israel puts its weapons down, it will be wiped off. All Israeli Jews, secular, liberal, progressive, conservative, will get what came to some of their fellow citizens on October the 7th, 2023. If the Palestinians and Hamas put down their weapons, there would be peace.
Right. I mean, just to be clear, a Palestinian state would probably not be in the area where Gazans are living. It would be in the area, occupied territories of the West Bank, which are controlled by the Palestinian Authority and not by Hamas. But on the basis of what James has said, why would Israel want to go on any pathway towards peace with an organisation that wants to destroy it?
Because in the longer term, we're only going to find peace if we recognise each other's right to exist and each other's right to statehood. That is something that's fundamental in international relations, isn't it?
I think we all agree. Certainly, I think with the Liberal Democrats and with the Conservatives, as Dame Harriet has talked about, there is a consensus about moving towards a two-state solution. What we're talking about here is the role of diplomacy and the timing towards that recognition. And
well, no, there's a big split between what you and Max have just said in terms of recognising a Palestinian state and being part of that.
Recognition in terms of securing peace, and that's where there is a discussion about diplomacy on this. But what we all want to see is peace in this region. We want to see a two-state solution, and what the discussion that we're having here and what's being discussed in the letters from parliamentarians is the timing and the role of that recognition in terms of delivering on that peace. I just think it's really important to be clear that I want to see the Labour Party, the Conservatives and the Liberal Democrats want to see a two-state solution, and the role of that recognition is part of, and the discussion about that recognition is part of moving towards that.
I mean, there is some evidence, as stated here in this headline, BBC News, anti-Hamas protests are on the rise in Gaza as groups' iron grip slips. Now, you can find various reasons for that, no doubt, and the Israeli bombardment will certainly have contributed to it. But there was also a poll last year saying there's been a big drop in support for the October the 7th attacks by Gazans and by Palestinians. A poll suggests 57% of Gazans think October the 7th was incorrect. Do you accept that their power and their grip is beginning to slip? This might be the opportunity to grasp the moment on Palestinian statehood.
I certainly hope that's the case, and it is heartbreaking what's happening to those brave Palestinians who are speaking out publicly against Hamas. On the other hand, I've also seen data from Reuters from a couple of months ago that suggested more than 70% of Palestinians are perfectly happy with what happened on October the 7th, and in fact, some of whom didn't think it went far enough.
Right. I mean, I think that poll is actually preceded the one I've just mentioned. It was in 2023. These are pictures here of Palestinians, Gazans, as you say, bravely protesting against Hamas, no doubt under threat of reprisals. But it has led to a sense, certainly in the region, that their grip might be beginning to be eroded.
And that's a good thing, right?
Right.
We need to be clear. That's a very good thing. No one's supporting Hamas here, are they? But what we are supporting is peace in the Middle East and the right for Palestinians to have self-determination in future and govern themselves.
Yeah.
At the moment, the status quo clearly is not working either for Israel or for Palestine.
I think the worry is that if the international community goes down this road without clear evidence that an alternative to Hamas is possible, then effectively it would be sending a signal that massacres work. That what happened on October the 7th, 2023, is a mechanism for getting what you want in the international arena. I think it would be a disaster.
Right. In the meantime, this headline, Israel denying food to Gaza is weapon of war, UN Palestinian Refugee Agency head tells the BBC. This is the Commissioner General of UNRWA, the UN agency that supports Palestinian refugees, has told the BBC we can expect that in the coming weeks, if no aid is coming in, people will not die because of the bombardment. They will die because of the lack of food. What should the UK government be doing right now, never mind thinking ahead to a peace solution or two-state solution, to stop this happening?
I mean, the situation in Gaza, as we all know, is just unconscionable in terms of the level of suffering. What the government is doing right now, it's already restored the funding to UNRWA and absolutely calling for that access for that humanitarian aid, being really clear in our statements towards Israel that it is vital that that humanitarian aid gets through, and we've been consistent with our support for that humanitarian aid.
Well, let's listen to one Conservative MP, Mark Pritchard, who has changed his mind in terms of his support for Israel.
And I condemn Israel for what it is doing to the Palestinian people in Gaza and indeed in the West Bank. And I'd like to withdraw my support right now for the actions of Israel, what they are doing right now in Gaza. Of course the hostages should be released. Of course that Israel has a right to exist. Of course the Israeli people, the Jewish people should have the right to live in peace. But so do the Palestinian people.
Do you share that view, Harriet?
Well, obviously I want to see food get to the people in Gaza. Of course I do.
Would you condemn Israel in the way that Mark Pritchard has?
I would not go as far as my colleague has gone, because I think it's incredibly important that the hostages are released. I think it's incredibly important that that Hamas, who've been, by the way, capturing a lot of this food themselves, that we get the food in a way that it reaches the people that it needs to reach and is not used itself as a weapon of war. As you know, UNRWA, which the government has restored funding to, there were some findings from Catherine Colonna, who discovered that some of the members of UNRWA themselves were members of Hamas. So I'm not saying this is an easy issue. I know that I share everyone on the panel will want to see food getting to the most vulnerable people in Gaza, to everyone who needs it, and for the hostages to be released.
I mean, we've just heard that Hamish Faulkner, the Foreign Office Minister, has confirmed in the House of Commons today, James, that the UK has jointly called for an emergency session of the UN Security Council on the dire situation in Gaza. Aid must be allowed in unhindered. Do you share that concern?
I think the way to secure peace in Palestine is for Hamas to surrender and give the hostages back. It's absolutely the case that the laws of war are clear, that you can't deny food to innocent civilians. And during the ceasefire, Israel let in over 25,000 trucks. And what happened there is that Hamas commandeered the food, as we know they do. They sell it on the black market at vastly inflated prices and use the revenue-generating mechanism that the aid provides to further their terrorist aims. So it's a very, very difficult situation. I should note that UNRWA, as Harriet pointed out, there have been serious signs of corruption in that organisation in the past. And the data that it's relying on, the IPC data, is notorious in not disclosing the underlying methodology and analysis data and numbers. It's also got a track record of coming up with these predictions. It doesn't, by the way, say that Gaza is suffering from famine, that it's facing famine. If you dig a little bit deeper into its report, there's a risk of it happening, but its predictions have been shown time and time and again to have been false.
Max?
Well, the blockade that's happening at the moment is causing a great deal of poverty. And at the moment, we need to have in our minds how we're going to make sure that the Palestinian people can feed themselves. And lifting that blockade is absolutely essential.
Let's update everyone on a story that's led many of today's front pages. Emergency services were called to a fire at the Prime Minister's private home in North London in the early hours of this morning. We're joined by a news correspondent for the BBC, Martine Croxall. She is at the scene. What's the latest, Martine?
The latest, Jo, is that a 21-year-old man was arrested in the early hours of Tuesday morning on suspicion of arson with the intent to endanger life, and he remains in the custody of the Metropolitan Police. And that follows a couple of incidents at properties with a link to the Prime Minister. The most recent one was at 1:30 on Monday morning here in Kentish Town in North London, and this was the home of the Prime Minister and his family before he was elected as Prime Minister in July last year, and of course now his official residence is number 10 Downing Street, and we understand that this property is rented out. There's been damage to the front door and that he's now boarded up, and there is a police presence here. The day before, on Sunday, there was also a fire that again damaged the front door of a house in Islington, not very far away, again in North London, that's been converted to flats. That's also linked to the Prime Minister. The London Fire Brigade say they had to rescue one person. No one was injured. But last Thursday, there was also a car fire here in this same street where I am in Kentish Town. Neighbours say that they heard screams of fire, and the flames from this vehicle lit up the entire street. It was put out quite quickly and nobody was injured. Now, of course, because this is an active investigation, not many people are saying very much at all. But the Prime Minister's office did say that the Prime Minister had thanked the emergency services for their work yesterday, but didn't want to go any further because police are still investigating. And in fact, it is in the hands of counter-terrorism police, because these properties, of course, are linked to a very high-profile public person, and they want to see whether the fires are all connected. And in the last couple of hours, the leader of the Conservative Party, Kemi Badenoch, has posted on social media on X saying that this is a shocking incident. Her thoughts are with the Prime Minister and his family. She said no one should face these sorts of threats, let alone people in public service. And she went on to say that this is an attack on our democracy and must not be tolerated.
Martine Croxall, thank you very much for giving us that update there from North London. Let's talk about free speech. Headline here, J.D. Vance, Vice President in the States, attacks Europe over free speech and migration. It was a speech he gave some time ago now. You're a close friend of the Vice President, and we heard at the top of the programme that he said free speech is under threat across Europe and here in the UK. Do you share that view?
Yes, I do share that view. I think that Munich speech resonated with a lot of people. The example that he cited was the case of Adam Smith O'Connor, who had been arrested for praying silently outside an abortion clinic because he had breached a buffer zone. But I think more recently, the Vice President has talked about other threats and attacks on liberal democracy throughout Europe. For example, German courts.
He's not interested in liberal democracy, though, is he? Let's be honest. He's an acolyte of a president who tried to overturn an election result.
Well, I think he is certainly in favour of liberal democracy. He's an elected politician.
Would he identify as a liberal?
No, I don't think he would. I mean, talking about liberal democracy and just in the broader sense, politically, he would not identify as a liberal. He would say he's a post-liberal. He thinks that the liberal project is unravelling, and he thinks that there's evidence of that all across the ballot boxes in Europe, Britain and America.
Liberal democracy support the overturning of election results and insurrection.
I don't think he supported the insurrection. I don't think he challenged the
Well, he's not the Vice President to a man who did.
Well, the contest.
Should we take lectures from those kind of people in this country?
We should certainly be taking lectures from. Well, we certainly be listening to our biggest military ally, and an ally that is providing enormously disproportionate financial support to keep NATO going, and has done for the last 80 years. It effectively kept Europe peaceful. And all that the Americans, I think, are asking is, look, it's time that you stood on your own 2 feet, that you increased your defence budgets, and that you looked carefully at very real threats to free speech, very real threats to electoral transparency, as we've seen with Marine Le Pen, with AfD, with Georgescu in Romania, all cases which Vance has pointed to and which I know many Americans are concerned about. And as is the case for the UK, I mean, there have been all sorts of cases in the last 2 or 3 years. We saw only this week a former constable being arrested by his former colleagues for, having suspicious literature on his shelves. We saw the journalist Alison Pearson being arrested for saying something perfectly lawful on Twitter. And so these cases are happening week by week, and I think the Americans look at that and say, look, this is a real shame. We believe we share values with you. We want to see you flourish, and we want to see the values that we're subsidising you to protect to be upheld.
Let me just show you. You're referring to this case covered in the Daily Telegraph, Max, and the two of you. Police face lawsuit after former officer arrested over thought crime tweet. Julian Fulks handcuffed at home by 6 officers in 2023 after replying to pro-Palestinian activists on social media. Is that an example of free speech in retreat?
I think it's an example of over-policing. I think most people who read that will think that's totally ridiculous. And I'm sure when the police read it, and I come from a policing family, there are police officers in my family, I'm sure when they see that kind of thing, they're probably embarrassed about it and they probably think we got that wrong. And it's perfectly reasonable for us to have a discussion about that and say we got it wrong without saying J.D. Vance is right, that in some way in the UK we're all being oppressed and we don't have free speech anymore, which clearly is a fanciful notion.
The police have confirmed that the caution was a mistake.
Yeah.
Is that what it's about?
Look,
police making a mistake rather than free speech?
All I would say that the police are making mistakes on a much more regular and frequent basis than they were doing before. Barely a month goes past without an incident like this happening. This is not a one-off.
But that was from 2023, apparently. So this isn't a month ago. This is 2 years ago.
Well, yeah,
and it's now been dredged up in the press, hasn't it, for this kind of discussion? So people you can come on and tell us that we've got a big problem.
The problem has been running for longer than 2 years. It's getting worse. Yes, this case goes back to 2023, but we saw just a few days ago the man who was arrested on a completely confected charge of attacking the institution of Islam for burning a Quran. Now, it's a completely repulsive thing to do, but it's not a crime, it's not unlawful, and the police had to apologise for that too. So I'm just saying that this is a more frequent occurrence than was the case.
Would you agree with that?
Well, we want to see the law updated just to make it very, very clear that these non-crime hate incidents, as they're described, should not be the things that the police are responding to.
Didn't you introduce them when you were in government?
I'm with Max on this one. I mean, it was the Tories who put in the College of Policing in 2012, and it's the Tories who oversaw the introduction of the non-crime hate incidents, and I think you've got a lot to answer on that front.
Well, our answer is that we want to get rid of it, so, you can...
This is a bit like your lines on immigration, isn't it?
You can change your views.
You had 11 years to get rid of it.
And it's clearly gone into some space that is unacceptable.
I mean, isn't it true, Rachel, that free speech, everyone's free speech is different. It just depends whose views you agree with. I mean, where do you draw the line between free speech and hate speech, which is a crime if it's inciting any sort of violence?
Well, you're right to ask about where that line is, and that's obviously the responsibility for the police, and we've seen an example here in terms of where we think that they made a mistake, and I think we're all agreed on that. One of the things that worries me about the allegation about a retreat of free speech is actually what people are talking about is how we have political debates, and one of the things I want to do as a Member of Parliament is be really clear about being able to agree and disagree respectfully. So Dame Harriet and I sit on a select committee together where we have an opportunity to agree and disagree on political stances, and sometimes we bring our different political values to it. But one of the things that is a worry about this allegation about the withdrawal of free speech is really we should be talking about the quality of political debate and how we should be running this country.
Right.
I completely agree with that, Rachel. And, free speech, not only is free speech not violence, it is the only and best antidote to violence. And the story we just heard about the arson attacks on Keir Starmer's properties and the attacks on MPs over in recent years, David Amos, of course, Jo Cox, Nigel Farage last year, it's just a sign of how important it is to ensure that we've got lively political debate that is not policed. That is not censored by invoking subjective determinations of what counts as hate, but allowing a fairly, not a friction-free, but allowing lots and lots of friction in public debate. Friction, lots of sparks come from friction. Those sparks can hurt, but they can also illuminate, and that's what we have always had a wonderful tradition of upholding, and the Americans look at us and see, look, this is a cradle of these ancient liberties. They gave us these ancient liberties, and now they're trampling on them.
But is it justifiable for the United States to intervene in the internal affairs of another country? I mean, you talked about the fact that they have done so much in the realms of defence and so on, and yes, that is true. But what is the justification for interfering in internal affairs of the UK?
He wasn't interfering. He wasn't saying you need to change the laws. He was simply observing that if you look at the larger argument of that Munich speech, it was, look, there's no point worrying about and spending billions and billions of dollars on securing Europe if we have forgotten the values that we share and that make Europe what it is.
He also made comparisons with Putin's Russia and other pariah states and said that we should be more fearful about what's happening in Europe and in the UK than there. And I think that is totally reprehensible. It's a fanciful notion. And the fact that you're sitting here defending that speech, I think reflects the fact that perhaps you're not so much in line with British values as you might say.
A lot more people have got into trouble in the UK for free speech offences than in Putin's Russia.
Right.
But they just end up in jail and disappeared if they're in Putin's Russia, don't they?
There's just...
Or they end up falling off a balcony.
Look, if you're going to... wield if you're going to wield the mantle
friction of debate to do with pushing people off
freedom, of liberty, of democracy, you've got to model it. You've got to demonstrate it.
This is absolutely extraordinary that you're defending Putin's Russia. I can't.
I mean, you did sound like you were there.
Like it.
Absolutely not. What I'm saying is,
you said that more people are pulled up to free speech here than there are in Russia. I find that extraordinary. We have a free press. Look at all the papers lined up here. Look at the discussion that you and I are having in a studio
here.
We
can source it later. The critical point...
Will you send me an email?
Gladly. The critical point is that if we are to preserve the values of liberty, if we're going to try to uphold freedom of association, freedom of speech, we've got to model it. And we want to confront the evils of the Putin regime. We don't want to be known or associated with regimes that lock people up for lawful speech. And there is a problem in the UK, there's a problem in Europe.
All right.
And it's
let's take at face value that you believe there is a problem. But where is that evidence, James, to say that the UK is locking up more people for free speech or breaching free speech than Putin's Russia?
Well, look, if you've got to get the comparisons right. There is no question that since non-crime hate incidents were introduced, 10, 12 years ago, there have been staggering numbers of people investigated for perfectly lawful speech, for saying things online, for saying things that are incautious, offensive, but certainly not unlawful, and certainly not deserving of a visit from the police.
Right. I mean, your government must be worried about it because they're reintroducing a piece of legislation aimed at protecting free speech on university campuses. So do you think universities here have failed to uphold free speech? There's obviously evidence, otherwise you wouldn't be introducing this legislation.
So on this piece of legislation, I think the government has taken some time to consider the functioning of the legislation. I've got 6-7 universities in my constituency, and I do talk to them. I do talk to them about life on campus and making sure that all students do feel safe on campus. I think it's really important that we have the framework, the legal framework, and the support for students and universities to feel safe on campus from hate speech, alongside the ability for academics to be able to...
But you admit there's been a problem then, hasn't there?
To teach. I think, well, from speaking to students, I think that students that I speak to have felt that there are issues on some campuses.
All right, we're going to talk about the assisted dying bill in England and Wales first of all, because it's going to be debated at the report stage in the House of Commons this Friday. Before we do, Scotland has its own bill. Let's have a look at the BBC News headline, MSPs to vote on assisted dying in Scotland. For the third time in Scottish parliamentary history, MSPs are set to vote on plans to legalise assisted dying. Let's speak to our correspondent in Edinburgh, Katrina Renton. Hello to you, Katrina. Could you briefly walk us through the contents of this bill?
Well, it's hard to decide, isn't it? It's hard to think of a more difficult decision for our elected politicians to have to make than on assisted dying. And the demonstration that's behind us at the moment is from the Glasgow Disability Alliance. They are against the changes proposed in the law. Now, there have been earlier demonstrations today also with dignity in dying. Now, This is the very first stage of the bill here at Holyrood. It's the first time that MSPs can vote on whether to proceed or not with it. The bill is not the same as the one that's going through Westminster. It is similar. The bill here in Scotland would allow a patient to request medical assistance to end their life, but only if they had a terminal illness and had been ruled mentally fit to make the decision by 2 doctors. As you said, this is the third time that MSPs will debate changing this legislation. It was twice rejected before. It was last rejected in 2015. Now, this is a free vote for MSPs. They have to vote according to their conscience. Now, we've heard from many influential MSPs throughout the last few weeks as we built up to today. The First Minister and the Deputy First Minister, we know that they will vote against the proposals. The Scottish Labour leader and the Deputy leader, they too will vote against, although we understand that the Scottish Conservative leader and his deputy, they are likely to vote for the legislation. So we understand also that because this is a free vote, we don't have the figures, but those who have spoken out publicly, we think this vote is going to be very tight when it comes to a decision at around 7 o'clock this evening.
Katrina Renton, thank you very much. Let's talk about the Friday's debates in the Commons, starting with you, Harriet. Have the amendments brought up at the committee stage made you change your mind about legalising assisted dying?
No, I'm still against giving the state the power to help you kill yourself, and I am not going to be in favour of this legislation under any circumstances, I'm afraid. But I have managed to get an amendment agreed with Kem Leadbeater, and this is going to annoy our free speech advocates over here. But what I don't want, if this does pass, is for someone to be watching afternoon television, you know, with advertising, not the BBC, obviously, and seeing, you know, funeral plan advertisements followed by call 0800 assisted dying on the afternoon television. So I've tabled an amendment with Kim to prevent advertising on television or pop-ups. You know, if you're looking for suicide online and it pops up, we just don't want to go there.
So you've got that amendment.
So I'm suppressing free speech, I'm afraid,
no,
James.
well,
What's your view?
I supported assisted dying at second reading. I will consider Dame Harriet's amendment. I'm also considering an amendment about assisted dying and children that I believe Dame Meg Hillier is bringing forward. But so far, in terms of the debate, I'm not planning to change my position on it overall. I think the way that we have in modern medicine, and also the ability for people with the means and the physical ability to travel in order to have assisted dying, does mean that it's the right thing to do here.
You voted for the assisted dying bill. How would you try and convince? It is a matter of conscience, so maybe you don't want to convince people, but if you think it's important, what would you say to convince those who or sort of persuade those who are convinced it's not the right thing to do?
I haven't attempted to persuade any colleagues of this. I haven't attempted to persuade any constituents of this, nor have I attempted to persuade any of my members of my family who have different views on this. All friends. I don't think that's the right approach on matters of conscience, as you say. As a principle, I am in favour of assisted dying. I had, as my constituents are aware, a number of issues with the bill as it existed from the second reading.
And has the committee strengthened those safeguarding measures?
I think some of them are possibly going to be strengthened and possibly allayed, but I was actually in the first reading, the second reading of the bill, I was convinced by David Davis, who said we should not stop the debate here, we should allow it to go through, by Luke Evans and by Simon Ofer, 2 GPs from different sides of the House, who both made very powerful cases for the bill to go forwards. My concerns were around doctors initiating the discussion, which I think borders on the dystopian, but also the asymmetric legal process, which would have ultimately been there at the end, relying on a judge asking questions, which I don't think would have been right.
James, your view?
Well, I mean, just to Harriet's point very quickly, I mean, no one thinks that free speech is an unqualified right, and that seems to be, your amendment seems to be a perfectly plausible, justified qualification on free speech in that instance. And I just to back up, I mean, I share Harriet's view. I think, you know, life is precious, and I think it's important that Parliament sends a signal that it values life, that it values a culture of life, even though that is going to lead to some very, very painful individual situations. But I'd just like to say, I mean, just
briefly,
observing the debate of the last six months, I think it's a sign of just how well our parliamentary democracy and process works. This is a very neuralgic issue, and it's been beautifully debated by both sides.
Good point to end on. That's all we have time for today. Thank you to all of my guests for joining me. Bye-bye.